The blood-red sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Kelton, Utah Territory, as Nora Calloway stumbled forward, her hands bound tightly with rough hemp rope that cut into her wrists. Tears streaked clean lines down her dirt-smudged face as 4 men outlaws from the notorious Fletcher Gang shoved her between them like a rag doll, laughing as though her terror was the finest entertainment they'd seen in months. "Please," she begged, her voice cracking as the tallest outlaw yanked her braid, forcing her head back at a painful angle. "I've done nothing to you. My father will pay whatever you ask." The year was 1875, and the small settlement of Kelton had grown rapidly since the Transcontinental Railroad had come through. What had once been little more than a water stop was now a bustling frontier town complete with the lawlessness that plagued so many western settlements. For 3 weeks, the Fletcher Gang had terrorized the region, robbing the stagecoach, holding up travelers, and now, kidnapping the daughter of the wealthiest man in the county. "Your daddy's money ain't gonna help you now, Miss Calloway," sneered Hank Fletcher, the leader of the gang. His breath reeked of cheap whiskey as he leaned in close to her face. "We sent our demands 2 days ago. Time's up." Nora felt her knees weaken as the outlaws dragged her toward the center of town. Most of Kelton's residents had locked themselves inside at the first sign of trouble. The town marshal had been shot dead the previous month, and no replacement had arrived yet. These men knew they could act with impunity. "I swear my father will pay. The bank in Salt Lake City doesn't release large sums without proper documentation. He just needs more time," Nora pleaded, trying to reason with them even as her heart hammered against her ribs. The outlaws laughed harder, the sound echoing down the empty street. "Hear that, boys? The lady thinks her daddy's still negotiating." Fletcher yanked her roughly to a halt in front of the saloon. "Your daddy tried to set a trap for us instead of paying. That makes you expendable." Fresh tears spilled from Nora's eyes as she realized her father's attempt to capture the outlaws had failed, and now she would pay the price. At 22, she had so much life ahead of her. She'd only returned to Utah from her schooling in Boston 3 months ago. "Please, mercy," she whispered, dropping to her knees in the dust. The outlaws erupted in cruel laughter again, circling her like wolves around wounded prey. It was then that the batwing doors of the Frontier Saloon swung open. The laughter didn't stop immediately, but it faltered as heavy boots struck the wooden boards of the porch with slow, deliberate steps. Nora looked up through tear-blurred vision to see a tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon light. He moved with a fluid, dangerous grace, his face shadowed beneath the brim of a black hat. He wasn't a large man, but something in his posture made the air around them go still. "Let her go." The voice was quiet but carried the unmistakable edge of steel. Fletcher turned slowly, his hand hovering near his holster. "This ain't your business, stranger. Best move along while you still can." The stranger stepped forward, and Nora could see him clearly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, with sun-bronzed skin and eyes the cold blue of a winter sky. A thin scar ran from his right temple to his jaw, and though he didn't appear to be in a hurry, there was nothing relaxed about him. "I'm making it my business." His eyes flicked to Nora, then back to Fletcher. "Last chance." The outlaw leader's face twisted into an ugly grin. "Boys, looks like we got ourselves a hero." The laughter resumed, but with a nervous edge now. Something about the stranger had them unsettled, though they tried to hide it. It happened so fast that Nora barely registered the movement. The stranger's hand flashed downward and came up holding a Colt Peacemaker. The report of the gun cracked through the air before Fletcher had cleared leather. The outlaw leader staggered backward, a look of shocked disbelief on his face as he clutched his shoulder. 2 more shots rang out in rapid succession, and 2 more outlaws fell to the ground, one clutching his leg, the other his hand where the bullet had torn through it. The fourth outlaw managed to draw his weapon, but his shot went wild as the stranger's fourth bullet found its mark in the man's upper arm. All four outlaws were down, writhing in the dust, but remarkably, all were still alive. The stranger hadn't killed a single one. The entire exchange had taken less than 5 seconds. Silence fell over the street, broken only by the moans of the wounded men and the ringing in Nora's ears from the gunshots. The stranger holstered his weapon and walked toward her with the same unhurried stride. Kneeling beside her, he drew a knife from his boot and cut through the ropes binding her wrists. "Are you hurt, miss?" His voice was surprisingly gentle for a man who had just incapacitated 4 armed outlaws without breaking a sweat. "No," Nora whispered, rubbing her raw wrists. "No, thank you." He nodded once, then stood and surveyed the wounded men. "Someone fetch the doctor," he called, and only then did Nora realize that townsfolk were emerging from buildings all along the street, staring in amazement at what had transpired. "Who are you?" she asked, finding her voice as he helped her to her feet. The man's eyes met hers, and for just a moment, something warm flickered in those icy depths. Vaughn Parrish. As the doctor was summoned and the wounded outlaws secured, Nora couldn't tear her gaze away from the mysterious gunslinger who had appeared from nowhere to save her life. She didn't know it yet, but Vaughn Parrish would change her world forever. The town suddenly came to life as people rushed from buildings, some heading to fetch the doctor, others moving to secure the wounded outlaws. Sheriff Hayes, who had been out of town investigating another robbery, galloped in on his lathered horse, having heard the gunshots from the outskirts of Kelton. "What in tarnation happened here?" he demanded, dismounting and surveying the scene with wide eyes. A shopkeeper pointed to Vaughn. "This fella just took down the whole Fletcher gang single-handed, Sheriff. Saved Miss Calloway's life, he did." Sheriff Hayes approached Vaughn with a mixture of wariness and respect. "That true, mister? They were about to harm the lady," Vaughn replied simply, as if that explained everything. Nora found her legs still trembling as the shock began to wear off. "They kidnapped me 3 days ago, Sheriff, from my father's ranch. They were going to—" She couldn't finish the sentence as fresh tears threatened. The sheriff nodded grimly. "Your father's been searching everywhere for you, Miss Calloway. Had half the territory looking." He turned back to Vaughn. "You got a name, stranger?" "Vaughn Parrish." Recognition flickered in the sheriff's eyes. "The shouldest from Colorado territory?" Vaughn didn't confirm or deny, merely inclined his head slightly. By now, Doc Wilson had arrived and was tending to the wounded outlaws, all of whom would live despite their injuries. The townsfolk were murmuring among themselves, casting admiring glances toward Vaughn and concerned looks at Nora. "Someone send for Mr. Calloway," the sheriff ordered. "Tell him his daughter's safe in town." An eager young boy jumped on his pony and galloped off toward the Calloway ranch 10 miles outside of town. "You need the doctor to look at you, miss?" Sheriff Hayes asked Nora. She shook her head. They didn't harm me physically. Just kept me tied up in an abandoned shack." She shuddered at the memory. "I'm just tired and hungry. Let's get you over to the hotel then. Mrs. Patterson will look after you until your father arrives." As the sheriff began to lead her away, Nora turned back. "Mr. Parrish," she called. Vaughn, who had been quietly talking to the doctor, looked up. "Thank you. I owe you my life." Something flickered in his eyes, something that might have been pain or perhaps just a shadow before he tipped his hat slightly. "No debt owed, Miss Calloway. At least let my father properly thank you." "Will you still be in town tomorrow?" Vaughn hesitated, then nodded once. "I'll be around." That night, after a hot bath and a proper meal at the Kelton Hotel, Nora sat by the window of her room, wrapped in a borrowed dressing gown. The town doctor had insisted on examining her anyway, and had treated the rope burns on her wrists with a soothing salve. Her father would arrive by morning, the sheriff had assured her. But it wasn't thoughts of her father that kept her awake. It was the memory of ice-blue eyes and the fastest draw she'd ever seen. Vaughn Parrish. The name repeated in her mind like a whispered prayer. Who was this man who had appeared from nowhere like an avenging angel? The sheriff's recognition suggested Vaughn had a reputation. A gunfighter, perhaps. But unlike the bloodthirsty men she'd heard about in tales, this one had deliberately wounded rather than killed. And there had been something in his manner, a controlled power, yes, but also a surprising gentleness when he'd helped her to her feet. Nora had been raised in privilege, the only daughter of a wealthy rancher and businessman. After her mother died when she was 12, her father had sent her east to school, wanting to shield her from the harsher realities of frontier life. She'd returned to Utah with Eastern polish and refinement, but those 3 days of captivity had stripped away her sheltered innocence. And now this enigmatic stranger had entered her life at its darkest moment. Sleep eventually claimed her, but her dreams were a confused mixture of terror and rescue, with blue eyes watching over her throughout the night. Morning brought the reunion with her father, James Calloway, who burst into the hotel lobby with fear and hope warring on his weathered face. When he saw Nora descending the stairs, he let out a cry of relief and rushed to embrace her. "My girl, my darling girl," he repeated, holding her tight. "When they took you, I thought. I feared." "I'm safe, father," she assured him, her own tears falling freely. "Thanks to Mr. Parrish." James Calloway pulled back, wiping his eyes unashamedly. "This Parrish fellow, where is he? I need to thank the man properly." "I'm not sure. He said he'd be around today." Her father's face grew serious. "The sheriff told me what happened. Said this man took down all 4 of those animals without killing a single one. Must be quite the marksman." "He was extraordinary," Nora admitted, remembering the fluid speed with which Vaughn had drawn and fired. They found Vaughn at the livery stable, checking the shoes on a magnificent black stallion. He straightened as they approached, wiping his hands on a rag. He wore the same dark clothes as the day before, but in the morning light, Nora could see details she'd missed. The quality of his attire despite its worn edges, the silver concho belt at his waist, the way his gun hung low on his hip in a well-oiled holster that had seen plenty of use. "Mr. Parrish," her father said, extending his hand. "James Calloway. I understand I owe you a debt I can never repay." Vaughn hesitated before accepting the handshake. "No debt, sir. I did what anyone would do." "But anyone didn't," James insisted. "You did, and I'm grateful beyond words." He pulled out a leather wallet. "Please, allow me to reward you for your courage." Vaughn's expression closed like a shuttered window. "Not interested in a reward." James looked taken aback, then thoughtful. "A man of principle. I respect that." He put away the wallet. "At least join us for dinner tonight. My ranch is only a few hours' ride from town. We can put you up in our guest room." Nora watched as Vaughn's gaze flicked to her, then back to her father. Something warmed in his eyes for just a moment. "That's kind of you, sir. Is that a yes?" James pressed, smiling. Vaughn nodded. "Yes, sir. Thank you. Excellent. We'll head out after noon, once I've finished some business with the sheriff." James turned to Nora. "Rest up, daughter. I'll come get you when it's time to leave." After her father strode away, Nora found herself alone with Vaughn for the first time. The morning sunlight caught in his dark hair, revealing hints of chestnut where it wasn't shadowed by his hat. "How are you feeling, Miss Calloway?" he asked, his voice low. "Better, thank you." She stepped closer, noting how he tensed slightly. "Mr. Parrish, may I ask you something?" His expression remained neutral. "You may ask. The sheriff seemed to know your name." Are you famous in these parts? A faint grimace crossed his features. Notorious might be the better word. As a gunfighter? Vaughn returned to checking his horse's hooves. Once. Not anymore. Yet you still wear your gun. His hands stilled. Hard habit to break out here. He straightened and faced her directly. Miss Calloway, you should know that men with reputations like mine aren't generally welcomed into respectable homes. Nora felt a strange fluttering in her chest at his directness. My father clearly disagrees. As do I. Your father doesn't know who I am. Then tell me, she challenged softly. Vaughn studied her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable. 5 years ago, I killed 7 men in a span of 18 months. All fair fights, all drawn against me first, but 7 men nonetheless. His voice was matter-of-fact, without bragging or apology. Earned myself a name I didn't want and a life I didn't choose. Nora absorbed this, searching his face. And now I avoid trouble when I can. Work odd jobs. Keep moving. Yet you didn't hesitate to help me. Some trouble can't be avoided, he said quietly. Nora felt something shift between them, a connection forming despite the vast differences in their lives and experiences. Well, Mr. Parrish, despite your reluctance to be rewarded, I insist on thanking you properly. She smiled at him. And I always get my way. For the first time, a hint of a smile touched his lips. I don't doubt that for a second, Miss Calloway. The ride to the Calloway Ranch that afternoon was filled with stunning vistas of Utah's rugged landscape. Nora rode beside her father, with Vaughn following slightly behind, his eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The Fletcher Gang had been locked up to await trial, but their presence had made everyone more vigilant. The Calloway Ranch sprawled across a verdant valley, with Snow Canyon's red rocks rising dramatically in the distance. A large main house built of sturdy timber and local stone stood proudly on a gentle rise, surrounded by smaller outbuildings, corrals, and bunkhouses. Cattle grazed on the lush grasslands, and horses nickered in greeting as the small party approached. Welcome to Calloway Springs, James announced proudly as they rode through the main gate. Been building it up for 20 years now. Vaughn took in the impressive spread with an appreciative eye. Fine place, Mr. Calloway. Built it from nothing after I brought Nora's mother out west from Philadelphia. She was a city girl, but she took to ranch life like she was born to it. A shadow of old grief crossed his face. Lost her to fever 10 years ago. I'm sorry, Vaughn said quietly. James nodded his thanks. Nora's the spitting image of her. Same spirit, too. Nora smiled at her father, touched by the comparison. Her memories of her mother had faded somewhat over the years, but she cherished what remained. Ranch hands rushed out to take their horses as they dismounted in front of the main house. Nora noticed how Vaughn handed over his reins reluctantly, his hand lingering near his saddlebags. Don't worry, Mr. Parrish, James said, noticing the same thing. Miguel here will take good care of your mount, and whatever's in those bags will be safe in your room. Vaughn nodded and retrieved the saddlebags himself, slinging them over his shoulder. Nora wondered what possessions were so important to a man who seemed to travel light. The housekeeper, Mrs. Abernathy, greeted them at the door with obvious relief at seeing Nora safe. Miss Nora, thank the Lord. We've all been sick with worry. I'm fine, Mrs. Abernathy, Nora assured her, accepting the older woman's fierce embrace. Thanks to Mr. Parrish here. Mrs. Abernathy turned tear-filled eyes to Vaughn. Then you're welcome in this house, sir, for as long as you like. Vaughn shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze, but managed a polite, "Thank you, madam." The housekeeper showed Vaughn to a comfortable guest room while Nora retired to her own chambers to freshen up before dinner. As she changed into a simple but elegant blue dress, She found her thoughts continually returning to their mysterious guest. There was something about Vaughn Parrish that intrigued her beyond the circumstances of their meeting. Perhaps it was the contradiction between his deadly skill and his evident reluctance to use it. Or maybe it was the glimpses of gentleness she'd seen beneath his guarded exterior. Dinner that evening was a pleasant affair, with Mrs. Abernathy outdoing herself to prepare a feast in celebration of Nora's safe return. James Calloway kept the conversation flowing, telling stories about the early days of the ranch and asking Vaughn diplomatic questions about his travels rather than his past. Nora noticed that Vaughn ate with impeccable manners despite his rough exterior. Another contradiction that fascinated her. "So, Mr. Parrish," her father said as they enjoyed coffee after the meal, "what brings you to our part of Utah?" Vaughn set down his cup carefully. "Just passing through, sir. Heading north, maybe to Montana territory." "Any particular reason?" "Change of scenery," Vaughn replied, but something in his tone suggested there was more to the story. James studied him thoughtfully. "Well, I hope you'll consider staying on for a while. We could use a man with your capabilities. I've got 3,000 head of cattle and always need good hands, especially ones who can handle themselves." Nora watched Vaughn's face, trying to read his reaction to her father's unexpected offer. "That's generous," Vaughn said cautiously, "but I don't usually stay in one place too long." "Because of your reputation?" James asked directly. Vaughn's eyes narrowed slightly. "You know who I am?" "I asked around town while settling things with the sheriff," James admitted. "They say you were the fastest gun in Colorado territory before you disappeared 2 years ago. They say you never drew first, but always shot last." Nora looked between the two men, tension crackling in the air. "And knowing that," Vaughn said carefully, "you still invited me into your home? Near your daughter." James leaned forward. "Mr. Parrish, I've met many kinds of men in my years on the frontier. Some wear their violence like a badge of honor. Others have it thrust upon them." He paused. "I believe you're the latter. And the fact that you disabled those outlaws yesterday without taking a single life tells me everything I need to know about your character." Vaughn seemed genuinely surprised by James's assessment. "Most men wouldn't be so trusting." "I'm not most men," James smiled. "And my offer stands. Stay on at least through the summer. Good wages, your own cabin if you want it rather than the bunkhouse, and a chance to put down roots somewhere people will judge you by your actions now, not your past." Nora found herself holding her breath, hoping against reason that he would accept. Vaughn's eyes met hers briefly before returning to her father. "I'll think on it, sir." Later that evening, unable to sleep despite her exhaustion, Nora stepped onto the wide porch that wrapped around the main house. The night was clear and cool, with a blanket of stars stretching across the vast Utah sky. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and breathed in the familiar scents of sage and pine. Movement caught her eye, a silhouette standing by the corral fence. Even in the darkness, she recognized Vaughn's lean frame. She hesitated only a moment before making her way down the porch steps and across the yard. He turned at the sound of her approach, one hand instinctively moving toward his gun before he registered who it was. "Couldn't sleep?" she asked, stopping beside him at the fence. "Not used to comfortable beds," he replied, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. "Or feeling safe enough to close both eyes." The simple statement revealed more about his life than any long explanation could have. "Is that why you keep moving? Because you never feel safe?" Vaughn was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. "Partly," he finally said, "and partly because staying in one place means people eventually learn who you are, what you've done." "What if they don't care?" Nora asked softly. "They always care, Miss Calloway. Eventually." "Nora," she corrected him. "Please call me Nora." At least when we're not in formal company. He glanced at her, his face half illuminated by moonlight. That wouldn't be proper. Neither is my standing out here alone with you in the middle of the night, she pointed out with a small smile. Yet here we are. That earned her a brief chuckle. Fair point, Nora. Her name on his lips sent an unexpected shiver through her that had nothing to do with the cool night air. Will you accept my father's offer? She asked after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. Vaughn sighed, looking out over the darkened landscape. It's tempting, more tempting than it should be. Then why hesitate? He turned to face her fully. Because I've spent 5 years avoiding attachments of any kind. They're dangerous for me and for anyone connected to me. Because of your past? Because there are men who'd like nothing better than to make their reputation by outdrawing Vaughn Parrish. His voice held no vanity, only weary fact. And they don't much care who gets caught in the crossfire. Nora considered this. Is that why you were so reluctant to tell me your full name when you rescued me? He nodded. I try not to leave my name behind anywhere I go. Yet you told me immediately. Something shifted in his expression. Yes, I did. Why? Vaughn looked away, back toward the distant mountains. I don't rightly know, but something in his tone made Nora suspect that wasn't entirely true. On impulse, she reached out and placed her hand lightly on his forearm. She felt him tense at the contact but didn't withdraw. I think you should stay, she said quietly. At least for a while. His eyes met hers, searching. Why? Because everyone deserves a place where they can sleep with both eyes closed. Vaughn didn't reply, but he didn't move away from her touch either. They stood together in companionable silence, watching the stars well overhead, until the chill finally drove Nora back inside. As she left, she felt his eyes following her all the way to the door. The next morning, Vaughn announced at breakfast that he would accept James Calloway's offer, at least temporarily. The older man beamed with satisfaction while Nora hid her smile behind her coffee cup. Excellent. You won't regret it, Parrish. We'll start you out working with the horses. Miguel says you have quite a way with them. And so began Vaughn Parrish's tenure at Calloway Springs. He declined the offer of a private cabin, choosing instead to bunk with the other hands, though James insisted he take his meals at the main house. Nora suspected this was her father's way of keeping Vaughn connected to them rather than isolated. Over the following weeks, Vaughn proved himself invaluable around the ranch. He worked harder than men 10 years his junior, never complained, and demonstrated skills that went far beyond his prowess with a gun. He broke horses that seasoned wranglers couldn't manage, tracked down strays in terrain where others got lost, and even helped the ranch foreman redesign the irrigation system to be more efficient. The other hands were wary of him at first, having heard whispered rumors about his past. But his quiet competence and willingness to teach younger cowboys eventually won their respect, if not their easy camaraderie. Nora found herself creating reasons to be wherever Vaughn was working. She'd bring water to the men breaking horses or decide she needed riding lessons specifically when Vaughn was tending the stables. If he saw through her transparent excuses, he never called her on it. Instead, their conversations grew longer and more personal. She learned he'd been raised on a small farm in Missouri, that he'd fought for the Union despite being just 16 when he lied about his age to enlist, that he drifted west after the war with no real direction until he discovered his unfortunate talent with a gun. In turn, she told him about her years in Boston, her passion for literature, her secret dream of someday writing stories about the West that showed its beauty as well as its hardships. She confessed how torn she felt between her love for the ranch and her desire to see more of the world. "You're fortunate," Vaughn told her one evening as they sat on the porch after dinner, her father having retired early with a ledger of accounts. "Most people don't have the freedom to choose their path. Don't you?" she challenged. "You chose to come here to stay." A shadow crossed his face. Sometimes running becomes its own kind of prison, Nora. The longer you run, the harder it is to stop. She studied his profile in the fading light. Is that why you disappeared from Colorado? You were running? Vaughn was silent for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. There was a woman. In Denver. He stared out at the darkening landscape. Catherine. She was a schoolteacher. Believed I could be more than my reputation. We were going to marry. Nora felt a pang of jealousy followed quickly by dread. What happened? A man came looking for me. Wanted to make his name by killing the famous Vaughn Parrish. His hands clenched on the porch railing. I wasn't home. Catherine was. Horror washed over Nora as she understood the implication. Oh, Vaughn. I'm so sorry. He killed her thinking she was hiding me. By the time I returned. He closed his eyes briefly. I found the man responsible. Made him pay. Then I left Colorado and never looked back. Swore I'd never let anyone else die because of me. Without thinking, Nora reached for his hand. This time, he didn't tense at her touch, but turned his palm up to clasp her fingers. It wasn't your fault, she said softly. You can't blame yourself for another man's evil. Can't I? His blue eyes met hers, filled with old pain. If she'd never known me, she'd be alive today. And if my father hadn't tried to trick the Fletcher Gang instead of paying them, I might never have been kidnapped, Nora countered. We can't live our lives in fear of what might happen, Vaughn. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb brushing lightly over her knuckles. Maybe not. But I can't forget what did happen. I'm not asking you to forget, she said gently. Just don't let it stop you from living. Something shifted in his gaze as he looked at her, a warmth that made her heart beat faster. For a breathless moment, she thought he might lean in closer, but instead, he carefully released her hand. It's getting late, he said, his voice rougher than usual. You should get some rest. Nora nodded, disappointed yet understanding. Good night, Vaughn. As she turned to go inside, his voice stopped her. Nora. She looked back to find him watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. Thank you for listening. She smiled softly. Anytime. The summer days lengthened, and with them grew the undeniable connection between Nora and Vaughn. They never spoke again of his past in such detail, but their conversations deepened in other ways. He recommended books he'd read during long, lonely nights on the trail. She shared her poetry and hesitantly showed him stories she'd written about frontier life. James Calloway watched their growing attachment with mixed emotions. On one hand, he'd come to genuinely respect and like Vaughn. On the other, he worried about his daughter falling in love with a man whose past might always haunt him. He's a good man, Father, Nora said one afternoon when James gently voiced his concerns. Perhaps the best I've ever known. I don't dispute that, her father replied carefully. But loving a man with his history won't be easy, Nora. There may always be someone looking to challenge him. And even if no one ever does, he carries wounds that may never fully heal. Don't we all? She asked softly. Mother's death left scars on both of us. Yet we've found ways to be happy. James smiled sadly. You're just like her, always seeing the best in people. He sighed. I won't stand in your way, daughter. Just be certain of your heart before you give it completely. I already am, she admitted, surprising herself with the certainty of it. The cattle drive in August brought new challenges to the ranch. 3,000 head needed to be moved to fresh grazing land 20 miles north, requiring all hands and then some. Nora, who had participated in drives since she was 16, insisted on joining despite her father's concerns about her recent ordeal. I need to get back on the horse, so to speak, she told him stubbornly. I can't live in fear. James reluctantly agreed, but made sure she was assigned to ride with the chuck wagon rather than working the more dangerous flanks of the herd. Vaughn was placed in charge of a group of younger cowboys tasked with keeping the cattle from straying into the rough canyons to the east. The first 2 days of the drive went smoothly, but on the third morning, ominous clouds gathered on the horizon. By noon, thunder rumbled in the distance, and the cattle grew increasingly nervous. Storms coming in fast, the trail boss announced as the hands gathered for a hurried lunch. We need to get these beeves to the valley before it hits, or we'll have a stampede on our hands. Nora watched as Vaughn conferred with the boss, pointing toward a narrow pass through the hills. His experience reading terrain had proven invaluable throughout the drive. The boss nodded in agreement with whatever Vaughn had suggested and began issuing orders to increase the pace. As the herd began moving faster, Nora stayed with the chuck wagon, helping the cook secure supplies against the coming storm. Dark clouds raced overhead, and the first fat raindrops began to fall as lightning split the sky to the north. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. A particularly violent thunderclap directly overhead spooked the lead steer, and within seconds, the entire front of the herd had turned and was running blindly back toward the rear. Cowboys shouted and raced to turn them, but panic had already spread through the animals. Stampede! The cry went up as 3,000 cattle suddenly surged into chaotic motion. The chuck wagon driver cursed and whipped the mules into action, pulling well away from the projected path of the stampede. But as they veered away, a will caught in a prairie dog hole, and the wagon lurched violently. Nora, who had been securing a crate of supplies, was thrown from the back of the wagon. She hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from her lungs. Dazed, she struggled to her feet as rain poured down, plastering her clothes to her body. Through the curtain of water, she saw with horror that a portion of the stampeding herd had broken away and was heading directly toward her. Fear paralyzed her for a crucial moment as the thunder of hooves grew louder. The cook was screaming for her to run, but her legs wouldn't respond. Then a horse and rider appeared beside her, moving so fast they seemed to materialize from the rain itself. Vaughn leaned from his saddle, his arm extended. "Take my hand!" he shouted above the storm. Nora reached up, and with one powerful motion, Vaughn swung her up behind him on his horse. She barely had time to wrap her arms around his waist before he was spurring the animal to a full gallop, racing to outrun the cattle bearing down on them. The black stallion responded magnificently, its hooves finding purchase on the slick ground as it stretched into a desperate run. Nora clung to Vaughn, her face pressed against his back as he guided the horse away from the worst of the stampede. They crested a small rise just as the leading edge of cattle thundered past below them. Safe for the moment, Vaughn pulled the horse to a halt and turned in the saddle to look at Nora. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, rain streaming down his face as he searched her features. She shook her head, still breathless with fear and the incredible rush of their escape. "You saved me." Again, something fierce flashed in his eyes. "I'll always come for you, Nora. Always." The raw emotion in his voice struck her to the core. Without thinking, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. For an instant, he remained perfectly still, and she feared she'd made a terrible mistake. Then his hand came up to cradle the back of her head, and he was kissing her back with an intensity that left her dizzy. When they finally pulled apart, they were both breathing hard, and it had nothing to do with their narrow escape. Vaughn rested his forehead against hers, his eyes closed. "I've been fighting this since the moment I saw you," he confessed, his voice rough. "Why?" she whispered. His eyes opened, revealing the conflict within. "Because I don't deserve you. Because my past is past," she interrupted firmly. "I'm not afraid of what came before, Vaughn. I'm only afraid of losing what could be." He studied her face, searching for doubt or hesitation and finding none. "Nora Calloway," he said softly. You are the bravest person I've ever known. She smiled through tears that mingled with the rain on her cheeks. Brave enough to love a former gunslinger? Brave enough to make him believe in second chances, he answered, and kissed her again as the storm raged around them. The aftermath of the stampede kept everyone busy for days. Miraculously, no lives had been lost, though several cowboys sustained injuries rounding up scattered cattle. The herd was eventually gathered and moved to their destination, albeit a few days behind schedule. James Calloway had witnessed his daughter's rescue from a distance and the embrace that followed. When they returned to the main camp, he took Vaughn aside. I saw what happened out there, he said without preamble. You saved my daughter's life again. Vaughn met his gaze steadily. I would die before I let anything happen to her, sir. James nodded slowly. I believe you would. He sighed heavily. She loves you, you know? Yes, sir. And I love her. Vaughn's direct admission surprised them both. But I understand if you have objections. Would my objections stop you? No, Vaughn answered honestly. But they would sadden us both. James laughed unexpectedly. Straight to the point. I appreciate that. He clapped Vaughn on the shoulder. When a man saves your child's life twice, it's hard to find grounds for objection, no matter what ghosts he carries. Relief washed over Vaughn's features. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me yet, James warned. Loving a Calloway woman is no easy task. They're stubborn as the day is long. I've noticed, Vaughn replied with the hint of a smile. Upon returning to the ranch, Vaughn moved into the small cabin James had originally offered him. It was proper, everyone agreed, now that his intentions toward Nora were clear. The ranch hands teased him good-naturedly about going respectable. But there was genuine happiness for the couple among those who had come to know them. As autumn painted the landscape in golds and crimsons, Vaughn and Nora's courtship blossomed. They rode together in the cool mornings, read to each other in the evenings, and made plans for a future neither had dared imagine just months before. But even as happiness settled around them like a comfortable blanket, Vaughn remained vigilant. Old habits died hard, and he knew better than most how quickly peace could shatter. He still wore his gun, still practiced his draw when alone, still scanned the horizon for trouble. His caution proved warranted one crisp October afternoon when a stranger rode onto the ranch. Vaughn was working with a young horse in the corral when he noticed the rider approaching slowly from the main road. Something about the man's posture set off warnings in Vaughn's mind. He handed the horse's lead to a nearby hand and walked casually to the fence, positioning himself so the corral post partially shielded him. The rider stopped his horse a respectful distance away and called out, I'm looking for Vaughn Parrish. Who's asking? Vaughn responded, his hand falling naturally to rest near his holster. The stranger was perhaps 40, with a weathered face and cold eyes. He wore his gun low, tied down in the style of men who used them professionally. Name's Dexter Rankin, the man said. You probably don't know me, but I knew Catherine Walsh. Vaughn went very still, the name striking him like a physical blow. Catherine's been dead 2 years. That she has, Rankin agreed. She was my cousin. I've been looking for you for a long time, Parrish. If you're here about Jenkins, I already settled that score, Vaughn said evenly, referring to the man who had killed Catherine. Jenkins was just a hired gun, Rankin spat. It was me who sent him to find you. To bring you to me so I could kill you proper for leading my sweet cousin astray. His face twisted with grief and rage. But that idiot wasn't supposed to hurt her. Never supposed to hurt her. Understanding dawned on Vaughn like a cold wave. You're responsible for her death, he said quietly. Your vendetta. Your hired gun. And I've lived with that every day, Rankin acknowledged, his voice breaking. But so should you. You brought your violence into her life. Got her believing you could be something you're not. Several ranch hands had noticed the confrontation and were slowly moving closer, hands hovering near their own weapons. Vaughn subtly gestured for them to stay back. "What do you want, Rankin?" Vaughn asked, though he already knew. "Justice," the man replied simply. "A reckoning. Killing me won't bring her back. No, but it'll end this thing between us. One way or another." Vaughn saw movement from the corner of his eye. Nora emerging from the main house, her expression alarmed as she took in the scene. James appeared behind her, holding her arm as if to prevent her from approaching. "There are innocent people here," Vaughn said quietly. "This isn't the place." Rankin glanced toward the house, then back to Vaughn. His expression shifted subtly. "You found someone else," he realized aloud. "Someone else to lie to about what you really are." Anger flared in Vaughn, but he kept his voice steady. "I never lied to Catherine, and I've never lied to Nora. She knows exactly who I am and who I was." "Then she's a fool," Rankin snarled. "Or you're still lying to yourself." He straightened in his saddle. "I'll give you until sundown. Meet me at the crossroads east of town. Come alone and armed." His eyes hardened. "Or I start visiting everyone you care about, starting with that woman watching us right now." With that threat hanging in the air, Rankin wheeled his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and dread in his wake. The ranch hands gathered around Vaughn as Nora broke free from her father's grasp and ran to him. "Who was that?" she demanded, her face pale with fear. "What did he want?" Vaughn looked down at her, his expression grave. "Someone from my past. Someone who blames me for something I couldn't prevent." "He's calling you out," the ranch foreman said, having overheard enough of the conversation. "You don't have to go, Parrish. We can ride into town. Get the sheriff." "The sheriff can't stop this," Vaughn said quietly. "And if I don't go, Rankin will come back. He'll make good on his threats." "What threats?" Nora clutched his arm. "Vaughn, tell me what's happening." He gently led her away from the others, explaining in low tones who Rankin was and what he wanted. With each word, her face grew paler, but her eyes remained steady. "You can't go," she insisted when he'd finished. "It's suicide. If I don't, he'll come after you, after your father, after anyone connected to me." Vaughn touched her cheek gently. "I won't risk that." "Then we'll leave," she said desperately. "Right now. We'll go somewhere he can't find us." "And leave your father? The ranch? Everything you love?" He shook his head. "That's no life, Nora. Always running, always looking over your shoulder. I lived that way. I won't let you. So instead you'll ride out to die?" Tears spilled down her cheeks. "I won't accept that." Vaughn gathered her into his arms, holding her close. "I didn't say I was riding out to die," he murmured against her hair. "I said I was riding out to end this." James Calloway approached them, his face grave. "I heard enough to understand the situation," he said. "Parrish is right, Nora. This man won't stop until he gets what he came for." "Then we'll stop him," Nora insisted. "Together." "No," both men said in unison. "This is my fight," Vaughn continued gently. "A consequence of the life I led before I came here. I need to face it alone." James studied him with shrewd eyes. "You've changed since you've been here, Parrish. You're not the man you were when you walked into that saloon in Kelton. Are you still fast enough?" The question hung in the air between them. "I guess we'll find out," Vaughn answered quietly. As the sun began its descent toward the western hills, Vaughn prepared to ride out. He'd spent the afternoon alone in his cabin, cleaning his gun with the methodical precision that had once been as natural as breathing. When the weapon was ready, he sat on the edge of his bed, head bowed in silent contemplation. A soft knock on the door roused him. He opened it to find Nora standing there, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. "May I come in?" she asked. He hesitated. It wasn't proper for her to be alone with him in his cabin, but the circumstances were far from normal. He stepped aside, allowing her to enter. Nora looked around the sparse interior. Vaughn had few possessions, and the cabin reflected that: a bed, a table with 2 chairs, a small bookshelf filled with volumes they had read together. On the table lay his gun belt. "I won't try to stop you," she said quietly. "I understand why you feel you have to go." Relief washed through him. "Thank you." She moved closer, placing her hand on his chest over his heart. "But I need you to understand something too. You're not fighting just for yourself anymore. You're fighting for us. For our future." Her eyes locked with his. "So you come back to me, Vaughn Parrish. You hear me? You come back." He covered her hand with his own. "I will do everything in my power to return to you, Nora. That's a promise." She reached up with her free hand and pulled him down into a kiss that held all the fear and love and desperate hope within her. When they parted, she pressed something into his palm, a small silver locket. "This was my mother's," she explained. "It's always kept me safe. Now it will keep you safe until you return it to me." Vaughn closed his fingers around the precious token, deeply moved by her gesture. "I'll guard it with my life." "Guard your life more carefully," she countered with a tremulous smile. "That's what matters to me." As the sun touched the distant mountains, Vaughn rode toward the crossroads east of Kelton. He wore his gun belt, the silver-plated Colt Peacemaker gleaming dully in the fading light. Nora's locket was tucked safely in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. The crossroads came into view, a simple intersection where 2 dirt roads met in the midst of open country. Rankin was already there, seated on his horse, waiting. Vaughn drew his mount to a halt about 20 yards away. "I'm here, Rankin." The other man dismounted slowly. "Didn't think you'd show," he admitted. "Thought you might run again." "I'm done running," Vaughn said, swinging down from his saddle. "And I'm done letting the past dictate my future." They stood facing each other across the dusty intersection, the setting sun casting long shadows eastward. A cool breeze stirred the sagebrush at the roadside. "Before we do this," Vaughn said evenly, "I want you to know something. I loved Catherine, truly loved her. Her death has haunted me every day. Yet here you are, ready to court another woman." Rankin spat. "Yes, because Catherine would have wanted me to live." Vaughn's voice was steady. "She believed in second chances, in redemption. Pretty words from a killer. I never claimed to be anything else," Vaughn acknowledged. "But I'm trying to be more." He took a deep breath. "That's why I'm asking you one last time to walk away from this. For Catherine's sake, if not your own." Rankin's face contorted with renewed rage. "Don't you dare speak her name again. You lost that right when you got her killed. We both played a part in her death," Vaughn said quietly. "Your hired gun pulled the trigger, but our feud loaded the gun. Killing me won't wash the blood from your hands any more than killing Jenkins washed it from mine." For just a moment, doubt flickered across Rankin's weathered features. Then his expression hardened once more. "Enough talk," he growled. "Draw your weapon or die where you stand." Vaughn sighed, resignation settling over him. "Very well." They squared off, hands hovering near their holsters, eyes locked in the ancient ritual of men who settled their differences with lead and gunpowder. The breeze stilled. A distant bird called. The world seemed to hold its breath. Rankin's hand twitched first, dropping to his holster with practiced speed. But even as his fingers closed around the grip of his revolver, Vaughn was already in motion. The Colt Peacemaker cleared leather and barked once. the report shattering the evening quiet. Rankin staggered, his own gun only halfway drawn. He looked down in disbelief at the spreading crimson stain on his right shoulder, then back up at Vaughn, whose gun remained steadily aimed. You didn't kill me," he said in confusion. "No," Vaughn agreed calmly. "And I won't, unless you force my hand." He gestured with the barrel of his gun. "Drop your weapon, Rankin. This ends now." For a tense moment, it seemed Rankin might still try to raise his gun. Then, with a groan of pain and defeat, he let the weapon fall to the dust. "You could have killed me," he said, clutching his wounded shoulder. "Why didn't you?" Vaughn holstered his own gun slowly. "Because Catherine would have wanted me to be better than that. And because I'm trying to become a man worthy of the woman waiting for me to come home." Rankin sank to his knees in the road, the fight gone out of him. "What happens now?" "Now I take you to town, to the doctor and then the sheriff," Vaughn said, approaching cautiously. "You'll stand trial for threatening me and the Calloways. After that, that's between you and your conscience." As Vaughn helped the wounded man onto his horse, he felt a weight lifting from his shoulders, the burden of a past that had pursued him for too long. He didn't fool himself that one act of mercy erased the lives he'd taken, but perhaps it was another step on the road to becoming the man he wanted to be, the man Nora believed he could be. The ride back to the ranch was long, with a stop in Kelton to deliver Rankin to the authorities. By the time Vaughn approached Calloway Springs, stars were scattered across the night sky, and a full moon illuminated the landscape with silver light. As he crested the final rise, he saw a figure waiting at the gate. Even at a distance, he recognized Nora, a lantern at her feet casting her silhouette against the darkness. His heart swelled at the sight of her, and he urged his tired horse to a faster pace. When he drew near, he could see tear tracks on her face and the exhaustion of long worry in her posture. Vaughn dismounted and stood before her, suddenly unsure what to say. She broke the silence, her voice thick with emotion. "When I heard the gunshot echo across the valley, I thought..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "I know," he said softly, "but I made you a promise." Nora stepped closer, her hand coming up to touch his face as if to assure herself he was real. "Rankin, wounded but alive, in the sheriff's custody in town. You didn't kill him," she breathed, wonder in her voice. "No." Vaughn pulled the silver locket from his pocket and placed it gently in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "I had something worth coming back for. Someone worth changing for." With a cry that was half sob, half laugh, Nora threw herself into his arms. Vaughn held her close, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling the warmth of her against him, feeling, for the first time in years, truly at peace. "Marry me," he whispered against her ear. "Not someday, not when the timing is right. Now, soon. I don't want to waste another day." Nora pulled back just enough to look into his eyes, her own shining with joy and unshed tears. "Yes," she answered simply. "Yes to all of it." They were married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. The weather had turned cool with the approach of winter, but the day dawned clear and bright, as if nature itself approved of the union. Nora wore her mother's wedding dress, altered by Mrs. Abernathy's skilled hands. James Calloway, tears glistening in his eyes, walked his daughter down the aisle created between rows of chairs on the ranch's front lawn. Cowboys and neighboring ranchers stood witness as the local minister spoke the ancient words binding them together. When it came time for the vows, Vaughn took Nora's hands in his and spoke from the heart. "I came to this place a man half alive, running from shadows and convinced I deserved no happiness," he said, his voice strong and clear. "You taught me that the past need not determine the future, that love is stronger than fear, that redemption is possible." He squeezed her hands gently. I vow to spend every day of our life together proving myself worthy of the faith you've placed in me, the love you've given so freely. I will protect you, support you, challenge you, and cherish you for as long as I draw breath." Nora blinked back tears as she responded. "When we met, I was certain my life was about to end. Instead, it was truly beginning." She smiled up at him. "You saved more than my life that day, Vaughn. You showed me what courage looks like, what integrity means. You've helped me become braver, stronger, more true to myself." Her voice softened. "I vow to stand beside you through whatever life brings, to be your partner in all things, to create with you a home filled with love and laughter. I choose you today and every day, without reservation or condition." As they exchanged rings, the silver band Vaughn placed on Nora's finger caught the sunlight. It was a simple design, elegant rather than flashy, much like the man who had chosen it. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared, and cheers erupted from the assembled guests as Vaughn drew Nora into a tender kiss. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening, with food and dancing and toasts to the happy couple. James Calloway, in a gesture that surprised and moved them both, announced that he was gifting them a portion of the ranch land on which to build their own home. "This place was always meant to be a legacy," he said, raising his glass. "Now it truly will be." Later, as twilight softened the landscape, Vaughn and Nora slipped away from the festivities to share a quiet moment alone. They stood together on a small rise overlooking the valley that would be their home, his arm around her waist, her head resting against his shoulder. "Happy?" he asked softly. "Completely," she replied, tilting her face up to his. "Are you?" Vaughn gazed down at his wife, marveling at how thoroughly she had changed his life in the span of a few short months. "More than I ever thought possible," he admitted. "More than I dared hope for. What happened with Rankin? Do you think it's truly over now?" she asked, a hint of worry creeping into her voice. "I do," he said with quiet certainty. "When I saw him in town yesterday, something had changed in him. The rage was gone. I think, in time, he might even find his own peace." Nora nodded thoughtfully. "And your past? The men who might come looking to make a name by challenging you. Most have likely forgotten me by now," Vaughn said. "And if someone does come," he shrugged slightly, "we'll face it together, just like everything else." She smiled up at him. "Together. I like the sound of that." As the first stars appeared in the deepening blue of the evening sky, Vaughn Parrish looked out over the land that would be their future, a future that had seemed impossible just months ago when he walked into a saloon and found a young woman on her knees, surrounded by laughing outlaws. Life's strangest turns sometimes led to the most unexpected destinations. He had entered Kelton a solitary drifter, haunted by his past. He would leave it a husband, with a home and a future bright with promise. "Thank you," he said suddenly, tightening his arm around Nora. She looked up at him curiously. "For what?" "For believing in second chances." Nora reached up to touch his cheek, her eyes reflecting the emerging stars above them. "Always," she whispered, and sealed the promise with a kiss. The years that followed brought both challenges and joys to Vaughn and Nora Parrish. Their home, built on the eastern edge of Calloway Springs, became known for its warmth and hospitality. The modest two-story structure with its wide porch and tall windows perfectly blended Nora's eastern refinement with the practical needs of ranch life. Vaughn's reputation as a gunfighter gradually faded, replaced by his growing renown as a horse breeder and trainer. The skills that had once made him deadly with a weapon translated surprisingly well to understanding and working with difficult horses. People came from as far as Colorado and Nevada to purchase Parrish train stock or to learn his methods. Nora, meanwhile, found her voice as a writer. What began as simple stories about frontier life evolved into articles for Eastern newspapers and eventually a successful novel about a young woman's journey west. Her work helped change perceptions about the territories, showing both the harshness and the beauty of life beyond the Mississippi. Their first child, a son they named James after Nora's father, arrived in the autumn of 1877. The boy had his father's blue eyes and his mother's quick smile, and from an early age displayed a natural affinity for horses that made Vaughn secretly proud. 2 years later, they welcomed a daughter, Eleanor, whose fiery spirit and love of books marked her clearly as Nora's child. A second son, Michael, completed their family in 1882, bringing a gentle thoughtfulness that balanced his siblings' more adventurous natures. Through it all, Vaughn and Nora's love deepened and matured like fine wine. The passion of their early days never faded but was complemented by a profound friendship and mutual respect that weathered every storm. They faced their share of hardships, of course. The harsh winter of 1880 nearly devastated their horse stock. A fall from a half-broken stallion left Vaughn with a badly broken leg that took months to heal properly. Nora suffered a miscarriage between Eleanor and Michael that plunged her into a brief but deep depression from which Vaughn's patient love helped lift her. Through each trial, they emerged stronger, more deeply connected, more certain of their bond. Occasionally, echoes of Vaughn's past would resurface. Once, when the children were young, a drunken cowboy recognized him in town and attempted to draw on him. Vaughn disarmed the man without violence, earning the further respect of the community. Another time, a journalist seeking to write about famous gunfighters of the West appeared at their door, only to be politely but firmly turned away. "That man is gone," Vaughn told the disappointed writer. "If you want a story worth telling, write about how people can change, not about how many notches they once had on their gun." In 1885, James Calloway passed away peacefully in his sleep. The loss hit them hard, especially Nora, but the ranch continued to thrive under their joint stewardship. They preserved his legacy while making their own mark on the land he had loved so dearly. As their children grew, Vaughn and Nora made sure they understood their family history, both the parts that brought pride and those that taught humility. They wanted their children to know that a person's worth wasn't determined by their past mistakes, but by their willingness to learn and grow from them. On their 20th wedding anniversary, Vaughn surprised Nora with a journey back east to visit the places of her education and to show their children the wider world. The trip was eye-opening for all of them, but especially for Vaughn, who had never ventured further east than Missouri. "It's beautiful," he admitted as they stood looking out over Boston Harbor. "But not as beautiful as our valley." Nora squeezed his hand. "No," she agreed. "But I'm glad they've seen it. Glad they know there's more to the world than just what they can see from our porch." "Is that why you brought me here?" he asked with a hint of amusement. "To broaden my horizons?" "Partly," she admitted, "and partly to show you where I came from, so you understand more of who I am." He nodded thoughtfully. "I'd like to do the same someday. Take you to Missouri. Show you the farm where I grew up." "I'd like that," Nora said softly, resting her head against his shoulder as they had done countless times over the years. Upon their return to Utah, life resumed its pleasant rhythm. Young James, now 18, took on more responsibility at the ranch. Eleanor, at 16, was showing serious literary talent that surpassed even her mother's, while 14-year-old Michael revealed an unexpected gift for medicine after successfully treating an injured ranch hand when the doctor was unavailable. In the autumn of 1895, 20 years after Vaughn had first walked into that Kelton saloon, he and Nora returned to the crossroads where he had faced Dexter Rankin so long ago. It had become a tradition of sorts over the years, a pilgrimage to the place where Vaughn had finally laid his past to rest. They dismounted and stood together in the fading light, hands clasped as they had been countless times before. "Sometimes I can hardly believe how much has changed," Nora said, looking up at her husband. The years had been kind to them both, adding silver threads to their hair and laugh lines around their eyes, but diminishing nothing of the bond between them. And sometimes, Vaughn replied, it feels like it was all inevitable from the moment I saw you. She smiled at that. Even with Outlaws laughing as I begged for mercy? Even then, he said seriously. Perhaps especially then. It was the first time in years I felt something stronger than fear or regret. He squeezed her hand gently. It was the first time I felt purpose. And now? She asked, though she knew the answer. Vaughn looked toward the distant mountains, then back to the remarkable woman who had changed his life. Now I feel grateful. For every day, every moment. For the life we've built, the family we've raised. He brushed a strand of hair from her face with tender familiarity. For the love you've given me, which I never deserved but have tried every day to earn. You earned it long ago, she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him softly. Though I hope you'll keep trying. He laughed, the sound warm and free in the gathering dusk. Every day until my last breath, he promised. As they mounted their horses to ride home, the setting sun cast their shadows long across the road, not separate silhouettes, but joined, overlapping, inseparable. Just as they had been since that fateful day when the outlaws laughed, and a silent cowboy drew first.